Rain struck Karen Stewart's face in slanting needles and ran down the inside of her collar as she crossed Queen Square before dawn, with a crate of candle stubs pressed hard against her ribs, the wood edge bruising through damp wool. She kept her head lowered because the wind bit worst at the eyes, yet she still saw boots slow, saw shopboys and bakers and a fishwife with her basket pause long enough to mark the arrangement, Lady Wrexham's lacquered carriage rolling behind, lamps lit, curtains tied back, and Karen ahead of it in a servant's pace, burdened and shivering as if she were freight too cheap to shelter. Her shoes had split open at both toes 3 days ago. Water seeped in with every step. The stockings underneath were already thin from mending and wore through where her heels rubbed raw. She had bound one palm in rag against a crack that would not close. The rag had loosened in the wet. Lye had burned the skin white at the edges yesterday. Now cold made it sting. The square smelled of horse steam, chimney soot, and stale beer spilled from last night's revels. Somewhere a church bell gave the half hour, low and dull in the weather. Karen shifted the crate higher and felt her stomach clench so sharply she had to breathe through her mouth. She had not eaten since a crust of yesterday's bread shared with the kitchen cat when no one was looking. By habit, she counted tasks to quiet hunger. 3 loads of linen before sunrise, 2 pails from the pump, 1 basket of mended cuffs for Miss Lydia, 1 ledger page to copy after midnight, 1 apology prepared in advance in case Lady Wrexham decided silence itself was insolence. She stumbled where cobbles sloped to a drain. Candle ends rolled inside the crate with a dry clatter. The carriage did not stop. A footman looked out once, then looked away. From within, Lady Wrexham's voice cut through rain and leather and wheel noise with perfect clarity. "Walk faster." Karen obeyed. She always obeyed in public because correction in public came with hands, and hands in public drew eyes, and eyes drew laughter, and laughter stayed in the bones longer than bruises. She was 21 and knew the pace of humiliation by heart. Her father had once carried her across these same stones so her boots would not catch in mud. He had owned the little music shop on Cheap Street with the green window frame and the cracked treble clef painted on the sign. He had tuned pianofortes for half the city and taught daughters scales they never practiced and sons discipline they resented, and her, at dusk, after shutters were fastened, the true labour beneath music. Read first, then feel. Feel first, then lie. Never lie to the bar line. He had died in fever when spring turned to summer, raving through 3 nights while bills multiplied at the bedside. Debts came after, hard and orderly as tax collectors. Her mother had died years before, too early even for memory to hold a full face. Lady Wrexham had been her father's second wife and had inherited everything that could be sold, then sold it, including the shop, including the walnut stool Karen used to sit on while he marked tempo with a pencil against his cuff. By the first week of November, the old house in Milsom Street no longer held a single room that belonged to her. Lady Wrexham took the front bedchamber. Miss Lydia and Miss Anne took the blue room and the yellow room, and sent dresses down to Karen to alter, wash, and mend. By candle ends she was required to save from chandeliers after guests left. Karen slept in the attic under the eaves where frost traced the nails. Her blanket smelled of damp plaster. She paid for thread with coins earned secretly by copying hymn sheets for a curate who thought she was Mrs. Davis's niece. Lady Wrexham took those coins when she found them and called the seizure housekeeping. At supper the table saw roast for 3 and thin broth for 1, if there had been no offence. If there had been offence, which meant anything from a late kettle to breathing too loudly while a caller praised Miss Lydia's complexion, Karen received nothing and was told she ought to be grateful for moral instruction. In drawing rooms, Lady Wrexham introduced her as my husband's unfortunate girl, plain, thin, and useful. Guests laughed softly and looked past Karen's shoulder, as if searching for the truly interesting person in the room. The carriage reached the assembly room's yard and swung wide under the arch, sending water from a puddle across Karen's skirt to mid-thigh. She did not flinch. Flinching invited notice. She set the crate down in the service passage where coal dust lay thick over flagstones, and where the walls sweated moisture that never dried in winter. Her fingers had stiffened around the handles. When she pried them loose, the skin at her knuckles split and reddened. She tucked her hand into her sleeve until the sting eased, then began sorting stubs by size, shaving the soft ends with a knife so they would sit true in rehearsal stands. The memorial concert was not until evening, but Lady Wrexham demanded the appearance of generosity from dawn onward. A patroness must be seen arranging details herself, and if she did not know how details were arranged, someone had to make ignorance look elegant. That someone was Karen. She moved between storeroom, side stairs, and dressing corridor with armfuls of folded programmes, wax, and copied song leaves, while men in good coats stepped aside exactly half an inch, granting passage without granting acknowledgement. She passed a gilt mirror near the green room and caught her reflection by accident. Wet, dark hair had come loose from pins and clung in ropes to her cheeks. Her face looked narrower than she remembered, eyes too large from hunger, mouth bloodless. People called her plain, and perhaps from a distance she was. Up close there was a severity to her features that did not soften for strangers, a stillness that made older women uneasy. She pressed her lips together and went on. At the top of the stair, Miss Lydia waited with a parasol she had no intention of opening indoors, satin shoes dry and shining, pearls resting like drops of milk at her throat. Miss Anne stood beside her in lavender silk and watched Karen's skirt drip on the runner. "You are late," Lydia said, though Karen had been awake since 4. "Lady Wrexham wishes the black gloves brushed again. You have left lint on the fingers." Karen answered, "Yes, miss," and took the gloves. Anne tipped her head and looked at Karen's hands. "Do not bleed on them." Then both sisters turned away together, laughing at a remark too low for Karen to hear and not worth hearing. The gloves smelled of violet water and old powder. Karen brushed each finger with a strip of velvet, turned them, brushed again, and laid them over the stove rail to warm. Her own hands trembled once, quickly, then stilled. Tremor came when she had gone too long without food. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper who served Lady Wrexham because there was nowhere else to go at her age, found Karen in the service alcove and pressed half an apple into her palm without speaking. Karen swallowed 2 bites before footsteps sounded, then hid the rest in her apron pocket for later and returned to work. Gratitude in that house could not be spoken safely. Spoken gratitude exposed kindness, and exposed kindness was punished. She carried the brushed gloves into Lady Wrexham's retiring room and stood while the older woman fastened jet beads at her throat and evaluated Karen by mirror reflection. Silk rustled. Rosewater thickened the air. "You will keep out of sight tonight," Lady Wrexham said. "If your face is seen near the platform, people will assume we could not afford proper assistance." Karen lowered her gaze. "Yes, my lady." "And if anyone asks after your father's shop, you will say the books were disordered and no account of consequence remained. I will not have strangers prying in old paper." Karen felt the hidden apple against her hip, the weight of its small mercy, and said only, "As you command." Old paper was all she had left that was truly hers. In a locked hat-box beneath attic boards she kept a narrow ledger with her father's hand on every page, tidy notes in brown ink, tuning fees, names, weather, and sometimes a bar of melody written in the margin with no label, as if he had heard a phrase in a customer's parlour and saved it before it vanished. She knew those margins by memory. She had copied them so often her wrist moved without instruction. Lady Wrexham exploited that skill whenever patrons wanted clean parts made quickly and paid, as if a copying clerk had done the task in town. The payment went to Lady Wrexham, the inkstains to Karen. Performance was forbidden. Applause would imply worth. Worth would imply rights. Rights would imply wages. So Karen read in silence, corrected in silence, and when she tested a phrase she pressed one finger to the wood of a table and hummed under breath so low the note lived only in bone. Music had become a private architecture she carried through rooms where no one wished her voice to exist. Toward noon, the rain eased into a grey mist that clung to window panes and turned the courtyard to dull pewter. Carriages began to arrive with trunks and instrument cases. Footmen shouted names. A porter dropped a crate of resin and cursed under his breath. Karen took inventory at the steward's desk because numbers were another thing her father had taught her to keep straight when frightened. 12 stands polished, 46 candles trimmed, memorial folios tied with black ribbon, 2 violins delivered, 1 violoncello delayed. She wrote each line in a hand so precise it looked engraved. The steward, a narrow man with tired eyes, glanced at the page and said, "Who taught you script?" She answered, "My father, sir." He grunted and moved on. Her stomach cramped again, harder now, and she pressed knuckles to it until the wave passed. Through the half-open door to the main hall, she saw rows of chairs under chandeliers shrouded in gauze for mourning. Black crape draped the balustrade. A portrait of the late Countess had been set near the platform, lilies arranged beneath. Even at a distance the painted woman looked gentle and alive. When Karen carried the last folio bundle to the stage wing, she paused at the threshold because music sounded from the hall, not played but tested. A single piano note struck and held, then another, a fifth below, then silence. The instrument had been tuned badly, she could tell from the beat between harmonics, slight but persistent, enough to trouble a singer's ear. Instinct moved faster than caution. She set the folios down, crossed to the keyboard, and adjusted one peg with the tiny wrench left on the lid. The correction settled the dissonance at once. She drew her hand back, as if burned, listening for witness. None came. She closed the lid and lifted the folios again. At the corridor turn Lady Wrexham stood waiting, gloved now, feathered hat perfectly dry, 2 ladies with her, and both already smiling in anticipation of an anecdote at someone else's expense. Karen stopped. Rainwater from her hem gathered and fell in small taps to the floor. Lady Wrexham's gaze dropped to the folios, then to Karen's face. "Do not hover near the musicians," she said in a tone meant to carry. "People may mistake diligence for ambition." One of the ladies laughed, the other looked away. Karen curtsied because refusal would cost Mrs. Davies, and perhaps the kitchen maid as well. "Yes, my lady." Lady Wrexham turned, silk whispering over boards. "When the guests are seated, you will wait behind the curtain. If anything goes wrong, you will step in, quietly. And if you fail, you will fail quickly." Karen stood very still until their perfume thinned in the passage, then bent, gathered the folios to her chest, and walked toward the dark behind the stage where no one looked until they needed someone to blame. She stepped into the dark behind the stage where damp wool, lamp oil, and rosin lived in the same breath, and set the folios on a narrow trestle table, already crowded with tuning forks, spare strings, and a silver flask someone had forgotten to hide. Men crossed the space in hurried diagonals, coats brushing her sleeve. Their urgency granted the dignity of importance, while hers remained servile by definition. A second violinist asked for clean cloth and did not look at her when he asked. A page boy dropped a box of pegs and glared at her as if she had caused gravity. She bent, gathered every peg, placed them in his palm, and resumed tying ribbon around the stacks in even loops. Her fingers still shook from hunger, but she pulled each knot tight and made no error. Around her, voices moved in fragments. Timing. Attendants, patronesses already arriving. The Earl expected at 7. The widow in blue wished to sit near the front. None of it belonged to her, yet every piece of it passed through her hands before the room could pretend itself effortless. She knew this labour well. She had become the seam between other people's ceremonies. She had become the stitch no one named. The lantern nearest her guttered once, then steadied. She watched the flame and thought of another flame years ago in her father's shop, a tallow stub fixed to a chipped saucer, while he bent over a score and tapped each bar with blunt pencil. "Count where you are before you turn the page, Kit," he used to say, "because the page will not wait for you when fear starts." He had called her Kit when she was small enough to stand on a stool and still failed to reach the top octave. He had smelled of cedar polish and tobacco leaf, and winter rain brought in on his cuffs. At dusk, customers gone, he would lock the front door and slide the bolt with a click she felt in her chest as safety itself. Then he would open the cracked green ledger and teach her numbers beside notes, fees beside fermatas, because music without accounts starved and accounts without mercy hardened. She remembered his hands more than his face now, long knuckles darkened with ink, one nail split, left thumbs scarred from a snapped string. Those hands had steadied hers over scales until precision felt like prayer. Those same hands had burned with fever at the end, hot and trembling against the blanket, while she cooled cloth in basin water that warmed again before she could cross the room. He had apologized for dying. He had tried to ask for the shop books. He had failed to finish the sentence. By the third night, the physician stopped promising. By dawn, the bell at St. Michael's was tolling for someone else, yet she heard it as his. Debt notices arrived before the flowers browned. Men who had laughed at his jokes in this very city came with ledgers and seals and voices suddenly formal. They did not shout. They did not need to. Order can ruin as completely as rage. She had been 15 when her mother's portrait was taken from the stair landing and carried out wrapped in a blanket as if memory were furniture and subject to valuation. And she had learned in that moment that grief could be itemized if a widow held the keys. Her mother's death had come earlier, a winter cough that settled deep and did not lift, and left behind only 2 things Karen could truly claim: a silver thimble, worn soft at the rim, and one lullaby hummed without words while brushing out dark hair by candlelight. Lady Wrexham arrived in her life after that, first as a visitor with patient eyes and low voice, then as wife with legal signatures and a new arrangement of rooms. At first there was courtesy. At first there was even broth sent up when Karen studied late. Then her father's business tightened, credit thinned, and kindness showed itself as investment maturing toward control. Lady Wrexham had 2 daughters already near marriage age and expensive tastes that moved like weather through a house: ribbons, French gloves, dancing masters, perfumed soap, carriage varnish, lace from Brussels too dear to touch, money left in streams too small to alarm and too constant to stop, Her father worked longer, tuned in rain, tuned with a cough he waved away, accepted delayed payments from men whose tables groaned with supper. After he died, Lady Wrexham did not wail. She summoned the solicitor before noon. She wore grey silk for exactly 6 weeks, and then violet. She spoke of prudence and family honour and unfortunate necessity while she sold the shop, dismissed 2 apprentices without references, and transferred every instrument of value to storage under her own name. Karen signed what she was told to sign because the paper was presented as protection from prison for her father's debts, and because no one in that room explained that protection could look very much like surrender. The deed to the house shifted. The key to the front study changed hands. The walnut stool vanished. So did the metronome with the brass pendulum her father had repaired 3 times and called stubborn as a bishop. Miss Lydia claimed it for her practice room, then abandoned it when she discovered discipline could not be purchased with furniture. Miss Anne took Karen's mother's shawl, the one with tiny darned stars along the edge, and cut it into lining for a cloak she wore once and forgot. Karen found scraps in the rag basket and pressed them flat in secret before placing them under her mattress board like relics. By the 2nd week of November, Lady Wrexham had reduced household accounts by declaring Karen non-essential to comfort but essential to labour. No wages because family, no proper mourning because unbecoming, no invitations because plain, no refusal because debt. Karen rose before the maids and slept after them. She scrubbed stair treads on swollen knees, hauled coal scuttles up flights meant for younger backs, copied pages by failing light until letters blurred, and learned the precise locations where bruises could be hidden under cuffs. Lady Wrexham's corrections came in many forms: a grip at the elbow hard enough to leave fingerprint shadows, a plate removed untouched while Karen stood in the doorway, a smile at guests followed by a whisper sharp as wire. Useful girls do not answer. Useful girls do not tire. Useful girls do not dream above station. In drawing rooms she was introduced as a charitable burden, and when laughter followed, Karen kept her face empty because anger fed cruelty more than silence did. Yet silence had a cost too. It gathered in the throat, heavy as wet wool. A violist brushed past and muttered apology without malice, pulling Karen back to the present, where the folios still waited and the hour moved whether she wished it or not. She carried the top stack to the prompt desk and aligned each score with the edge, then slipped 1 volume free and opened it just enough to check pagination. Black ribbon, cream paper, ink fresh on copied titles. Under that surface, she recognised patterns she had copied from memory so often they seemed carved into her wrist. Lady Wrexham took patron credit for every finished page, but the hand in the margins had been Karen's when haste required corrections. The logic in the breathing marks had been Karen's when singers failed to agree. The restored inner lines in old trios had been Karen's when missing bars threatened embarrassment. She did not own the work. She knew that. Still, each hidden notation was proof that she existed beyond utility. Mrs. Davies appeared at her shoulder carrying a basket of warmed napkins and spoke while setting it down, her gaze fixed ahead as if remarking only on weather. "You will keep to the side curtain until called." Karen nodded. Mrs. Davies lowered her voice further. "Lady Wrexham has told the steward you are a copying drudge only. If any gentleman asks, you answer in as few words as possible." Karen swallowed. "Yes." A pause. Then, softer still, "Eat this now." From beneath the napkins, Mrs. Davies pushed a heel of bread wrapped in cloth. Karen tucked her body behind a hanging drop-cloth and ate in 3 careful bites, forcing each mouthful slowly so her stomach would not revolt. Crumbs clung to the crack in her lower lip. She wiped them with the back of her hand and pressed the cloth back into Mrs. Davies's basket before anyone could see. The older woman did not nod, did not smile, only lifted the basket and moved away with the grave composure of servants who survived by never being caught in compassion. Karen returned to the table and sorted the final leaves. Her mind drifted once, unwillingly, to the attic where the hat box lay under loose board and held the one ledger she had hidden from seizure. Her father's handwriting there remained steady even in weeks when receipts thinned. Rain today. Tuned Broadwood at Crescent. Child in red coat sang while waiting. Promised payment next quarter. Beside one entry he had written in hurried side script, Kay read this at sight by age 10. Proud. She had touched that word so often the paper had worn smooth. Proud. Not useful. Not burden. Proud. She carried it like a coal that did not go out, even when cold stung to bone. As twilight deepened, gaslights in the hall were raised one by one until gold spilled under the wing curtain and turned dust into drifting fire. Guests entered in waves of silk and black crepe, voices lowered to mournful register, yet sharpened by curiosity. The late Countess's portrait drew clusters of murmured admiration. Programme leaves fluttered like pale birds in gloved hands. From her narrow position, behind the side drape, Karen saw only segments of that world. Jewelled wrists, polished shoes, a cane tip tapping impatience, the black sleeve of a clergyman. Then Lady Wrexham passed near enough that rose water and starch announced her before her words did. "Stand straight," she said without turning her head. "If anyone glances this way, do not look grateful. It makes your face smaller." Karen straightened. Lady Wrexham continued, voice smooth for nearby listeners. "Remember what you are. If called, you will obey. If blamed, you will accept. I will not be shamed by your ambition." She moved on before Karen could answer, daughters floating behind like bright cold satellites in their morning silks, each carrying a fan that had once belonged to Karen's mother's trousseau chest before inheritance became scavenging by rank. Karen rested one hand on the prompt desk to steady the sudden rush in her ears. Across the hall the piano waited with its lid raised, keys pale under the lamps. She could feel the instrument from here, its slight sharpness in the upper register, the repaired string near middle C, the action a shade heavy from damp. Her father had taught her to hear defects before first touch. He had taught her that an honest player adapted and never blamed the mechanism. She had adapted to far worse than stubborn hammers. She had adapted to hunger, to commands, to days measured by tasks and nights measured by pages copied in secret. Yet, as the audience settled and the first hush spread outward from the front rows, she felt the full weight of the road that had brought her to this curtain edge. A mother buried young, a father worked to death, a home converted into hierarchy, a name thinned to function, and still stubbornly, a mind full of music no one had managed to beat out of her. The steward lifted his hand for quiet. Somewhere in the wing a singer whispered for water. Karen drew one measured breath, folded her raw fingers together so they would not betray the trembling, and waited where she had been placed, unseen but prepared. The steward's raised hand had barely settled the hall when a hard sound cracked from the dressing corridor behind Karen, not the dropped clatter of pegs or the ordinary stumble of hurried feet, but the full weight of a body striking boards. A singer gasped. Someone shouted for space. Karen moved before she was summoned, skirts gathering at her knees as she slipped behind a hanging curtain and found the pianist sprawled beside an overturned stool, his face ashen, one hand clenched against his waistcoat, as if he had tried to hold himself upright by force alone. The smell of spilled spirits burned in the air. A lantern swung on its hook and threw moving light over his collar, already dark with sweat. "Do not crowd him," Karen said, and did not recognise her own voice until men twice her size obeyed. She knelt on splintered boards, pressed 2 fingers to his wrist, and counted. The pulse fluttered, then vanished, then returned weakly. A page boy stood frozen with a water jug in both hands. "Fetch the physician from the 2nd row," she said. "Grey whiskers, blue ribbon at his lapel." The boy bolted. Behind them the audience's hush began to fray into murmurs. Then a second cry rose near the instrument table. The first violinist had snatched for fresh rosin, caught the rim of a broken glass pot, and sliced the heel of his palm. He swore softly and dropped his bow. Resin dust clouded up like smoke. Blood welled bright against his cuff. The concertmaster barked for cloth. No cloth appeared. Karen tore the rag binding from her own palm, wrapped it around the violinist's hand, and pulled it tight enough to slow the seep. He hissed through his teeth and stared at her with startled gratitude and offence mingled, as if he had only just noticed she had hands worth using. "Keep it above your heart," she said. "Do not clench." He nodded once. The steward arrived at a run, face already grey with calculation. "We delay 5 minutes," he whispered, which was another way of saying disaster had begun and must not be named. Through the curtain 200 guests shifted in upholstered chairs, programmes whispering open and shut. The memorial portrait stood under gaslight and lilies, while backstage order collapsed by the breath. A tenor muttered that the hall would riot if kept waiting. A contralto asked whether Lady Wrexham had arranged any understudy. No one answered because they all knew the answer. Lady Wrexham arranged appearances, never contingencies. By the time the corridor clock struck 7, each second was audible. The physician came, crouched by the fallen pianist, and called for 2 footmen to carry him to the retiring room. The violinist flexed his fingers against Karen's makeshift bandage and tested the bow with a grimace that suggested pain and stubbornness had reached a temporary treaty. The steward wiped his forehead with a cuff already damp and looked at the line of empty stage steps as if they might produce salvation by carpentry. "We require hands at the keyboard now," he said to no one in particular. "A simple reduction. Keep the singers in key. No flourishes." He turned toward the musicians, scanning faces that looked pointedly away. One accompanist had not arrived. Another had gone pale at the sight of the collapse. Lady Wrexham appeared then as if conjured by the scent of risk, black silk immaculate, daughters at her shoulders, rose water slicing through sweat and lamp smoke. She took in the physician, the removed stool, the violinist's bound hand, and the steward's panic in one swift assessment, and chose her target with practised economy. Her fingers closed around Karen's upper arm. The grip found yesterday's bruise and pressed. "You," she said between her teeth, "sit there, fail quickly, spare me scandal." Karen held still because recoiling would invite a scene, and a scene would punish Mrs. Davies before dawn. "My lady, I'm not announced," she said. Lady Wrexham leaned closer, smile fixed for the passing patron who could see only profile. "You are not anything. You are useful. Do as told." Miss Lydia's fan clicked open beside her cheek. Miss Anne looked past Karen as if she had addressed a coat rack. The steward hesitated. He had heard the order and recognised cruelty when clothed as practical necessity, yet necessity was the only language the room understood. "Can you read at sight?" he asked Karen, voice low and urgent. "Yes, sir." "Can you follow a conductor?" "Yes." Lady Wrexham released her arm with a small shove toward the stairs. "Then run along and redeem your keep." The hall beyond the curtains swelled with restless sound. not yet open displeasure, but the brittle murmur that precedes it. A gentleman near the front laughed too loudly. Someone called, "Shall we hear music tonight?" The steward closed his eyes for one heartbeat and then opened them hard. "Miss Stewart," he said, giving her name for the first time, "you will take the bench on my signal." His hand shook once as he adjusted his cravat. "If questioned, you are temporary staff." Karen bowed her head. Temporary staff. She might have smiled at the accuracy if her stomach had not twisted so sharply. She could feel the place where Lady Wrexham's fingers had dug into flesh. She could feel wet cloth cooling at her ankles. She could feel, most of all, the old training rise through fear the way breath rises when lungs are kicked. Count where you are before you turn the page. Do not lie to the bar line. She lifted the nearest memorial folio from the stack, tucked it under her arm, and mounted the stage steps while the steward stepped through the side curtain and announced a brief adjustment in the programme with the smooth, false calm of men paid to stand between wealth and inconvenience. Gaslight struck her full in the face at the top step. Heat from the jets hit her skin. Beyond it the hall opened in a sweep of black crepe, polished wood, and watching eyes. Rows of morning silk and dark coats turned toward her in collective disbelief. She heard the intake of breath pass through the audience like one long thread being pulled. Her hem left a damp crescent on the boards as she crossed to the piano. The bench was set too low. She raised it one notch with hands that wished to tremble and did not dare. At the edge of her vision she saw Lady Wrexham settle into a side seat with the composure of a patron unsullied by logistics, daughters arranging skirts like stage props around her. Karen placed the folio on the stand and opened to the marked page. Ink. Black ribbon. Her father's old copy symbols hiding beneath newer titles like bones under plaster. She fixed her eyes on the clef to avoid looking at faces. The conductor lifted his baton, uncertain whether to begin. Then movement in the front row shifted the axis of the room. A tall man in morning black rose without haste and stepped into the aisle. Everyone in Bath knew that profile, Elias Ashford, Earl of Halhurst. War had left a pale scar at his temple and another narrower along the jaw that tightened now like carved stone. His hair was dark, cropped shorter than fashion. His shoulders filled the space without ornament. Grief had pared him to edges. He had not spoken publicly since his wife's burial 3 months earlier. He crossed to the foot of the platform and stopped where the gaslight failed into shadow, close enough that Karen could see rain still silvering his coat sleeve from the ride in, close enough that she could not pretend he was a portrait like the one set among lilies. He looked first at the music, then at her hands, then at the bruised crescent darkening her wrist where the cuff had slipped. His gaze returned to her face and held with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny than inventory. She lowered her eyes because rank required it, and because those eyes were the colour of deep water under storm, unreadable and cold enough to warn. "My lord," the steward began, hurrying down 2 steps, "a brief substitution only, until we—" The Earl lifted one hand. The steward stopped as if struck by silence itself. "What is your name?" the Earl asked Karen. "Karen Stewart, my lord." "You are employed by whom?" She did not glance toward Lady Wrexham. "By Lady Wrexham's household, my lord." "Not by this hall." "No, my lord." The Earl's jaw tightened once. "You are wet through." The words were not concern. They were fact placed on the floor between them. "It rained, my lord." Behind him, whispers spread, quick and sharp. Lady Wrexham rose half from her chair and called with polished brightness, "Lord Halhurst, the girl is accustomed to rough errands. She is eager to be of service tonight." Her smile turned toward the nearest patroness. One must make use of whatever is at hand in moments of inconvenience. Miss Lydia laughed softly into her fan. Miss Anne studied her gloves. The Earl did not look at them. "Steward," he said, still watching Karen, "has she seen this programme before now?" The steward swallowed. "She has handled the folios in preparation, my lord. I cannot attest further." Lady Wrexham answered before he could continue. "She copies a neat hand, nothing more. If she falters, we shall cut the memorial song and proceed to recitation." Her tone sharpened by a degree. "You need not concern yourself with servant nerves." At that, the Earl turned his head toward Lady Wrexham with such measured stillness that 3 people in the nearest row looked away first. "I concern myself with my wife's memorial," he said. No volume, no strain. The sentence landed harder for being stripped to bone. Then he faced Karen again. "Show me the first page." She lifted the folio and angled it down the light. He mounted 1 step of the platform, enough to see the notation, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cold air and saddle leather beneath morning wool. His finger, bare of ring, touched the margin beside the soprano line where an old pencil mark curved through an omitted bar. Not many would have seen it. Fewer would have understood it. His eyes narrowed. "This copy carries corrections," he said. "Yes, my lord." "In whose hand?" She could not answer fully without exposing what Lady Wrexham had worked to bury, yet falsehood here would break in the first phrase. "Some are mine, my lord. Some were my father's." A beat of silence. The conductor held his baton, suspended, arm beginning to shake with strain. 200 listeners watched a servant answer an earl and sensed, without understanding, that the balance of the evening had shifted by a fraction no one could measure. "Your father's name," the earl said. "David Stewart, my lord, formerly of Cheap Street." Recognition moved through his face in the smallest alteration, not warmth, not softness, but a recalibration, as if a map he had carried privately had just acquired 1 missing road. He stepped back down from the platform. His voice, when it came again, was clipped and cold enough to cut through hall murmur, backstage panic, Lady Wrexham's perfume, all of it. "Play nothing from memory. You will follow the score." Karen met his gaze for 1 breath, then bowed her head. "Yes, my lord." He did not move aside at once. He stood at the platform's edge, eyes fixed on her hands, as she placed them above the keys. The first chord had not sounded yet. Still, the hall had gone utterly still, as if every person present understood that the night had ceased to belong to Lady Wrexham, or to rumour or to proper sequence, and had narrowed instead to a wet-skirted girl at a piano and the silent Earl who had chosen to speak. Karen lowered her hands to the keys and took the first chord exactly as written, without flourish, without claim, giving the room a plain A minor that held its shape beneath the strings. The conductor brought the violins in on her 3rd measure. Resin breathed. Gut strings answered. The beat steadied. She read ahead 2 bars at a time, then 4, counting rests under her breath while rainwater cooled against her calves. The piano action dragged slightly in the upper middle register. She adjusted pressure and kept the line clean. From the corner of her sight she saw the Earl step back into shadow at the platform edge, still watching her hands. The opening hymn passed without fracture. A recitative followed for contralto and cello. Then the memorial song began, the one all Bath had come to hear and none had admitted might fail. Karen turned the page and felt her throat close. The soprano line was intact for 8 bars. The accompaniment beneath was not. 2 full measures had been scraped thin by old erasure, then overwritten with marks from a copyist who had not understood the harmony and had abandoned the attempt. In the margin sat a pencil curl she knew as she knew her own pulse, her father's shorthand for delayed resolution, and beside it, faint enough to miss in gaslight, one word, wait. She did not let her hands pause. Left hand held the pulse. Right hand took the written line, then the unwritten one, rebuilding from the contour of the melody and the breathing marks the Countess had set in brown ink. She heard her father at the shop table. Read first, then feel first, then lie. Never lie to the bar line. So, she did not lie. She supplied an inner voice the singers could trust, gave the tenor his entry with one low note shifted to spare the violinist's injured hand, and brought them back to the tonic as if the page had never broken at all. A murmur moved through the first rows, not displeasure now, but surprise sharpened into attention. People who had prepared to patronize a servant's failure leaned forward instead. The soprano, startled on the first phrase by the sturdiness beneath her, found courage and lifted the line. The conductor's baton dropped by a fraction, then lifted with renewed certainty. Karen kept her eyes on the staff. If she looked up and saw faces, fear would take one finger first, then both. By the time the second verse entered, the hall had settled into a stillness so complete she could hear cloth slide against cloth as guests shifted to listen better. She turned another page. Again, the score fractured. The Countess had left only melody and text at the centre section, then silence, where accompaniment should have carried grief into cadence. Someone had penciled a crude reduction in haste. It would have collapsed the singer into a dead end. Karen rejected it in one glance and wrote in sound instead, tracing the Countess's phrasing from the lyric itself, giving air where breath was needed, weight where memory should hurt. Her hands stopped trembling. Hunger fell away. There was only count, interval, release. From the front row came a small, sharp cry. It cut through the texture like glass. Karen looked despite herself. A boy stood at the end of the Earl's row, half hidden by an usher who had risen too slowly. He could not have been more than 6. Dark hair too long at the neck, black collar too tight for his throat. His hands were clamped hard over his ears. His mouth opened on a second cry that broke into breathless gasps. Beside him a nurse tried to pull him down into his seat and failed. The nearest guests turned, then turned farther away. Polite horror masking relief that the scene was not theirs. Thomas, she thought, though no one had introduced him. The Earl's son. The room knew his name even when it did not speak it. The conductor snapped his baton once in her direction, the universal command to continue. She continued for 2 measures. On the third, the boy lurched toward the aisle, struck a chair leg and folded to his knees with a sound too close to panic for ceremony. The nurse whispered urgently and reached for him again. He flinched from her touch as if from flame. Lady Wrexham's voice came from the side seats, low and vicious behind a social smile. "Do not stop." Karen's right hand missed one note. The wrong pitch rang bright and thin before she corrected. Thomas made a choking noise and tried to breathe through it. No one moved quickly enough. No one wished to be first. She closed the folio. The last chord she had played hung in the chandeliers and died. A wave of astonishment hit the hall. The soprano froze mid-phrase. The conductor lowered his baton as if he no longer trusted his own arm. Lady Wrexham rose halfway from her chair. "Sit down at once," she hissed. Karen was already off the bench. Her wet hem caught on the pedal lyre. She tore free, crossed the front edge of the platform, and went down the stage steps without grace, one hand on the rail, the other lifting her skirt clear of candle brackets. A footman reached as if to block her, and then stepped back when she did not slow. She dropped to her knees beside the child, silk and rainwater and dust all at once under her palms. "Thomas," she said softly, though she had no right to use his name, "look at me." He shook his head so hard his hair struck his cheeks. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" "It has stopped." She kept her voice low enough that the nearest row had to lean to hear. "Hear me. It is quiet now." His breathing came in rapid pulls that never filled. His fingers were white at the knuckles where they pressed his ears. Karen moved one hand to her own chest and took a slow breath he could watch. Then another. "With me. In. Out." The nurse crouched opposite, near tears. "Master Thomas, please." He didn't hear her. He watched Karen's mouth move and failed the next breath, and the next. She recognized the pattern from fever nights and children in market crushes. The body trapped in fright so deep it forgot ordinary instruction. Words would not reach him fast enough. Something older might. She let her hand fall lightly to the carpet between them, not touching him yet, and hummed a single note under breath. Low, steady, then 2 notes rising, a third falling back. The fragment sat in the air bare and private, a cradle rhythm from another room years ago where her mother had brushed out dark hair by candlelight. Thomas flinched once, then stilled. She sang the next line without words. The melody was the same contour she had just played from the Countess's song, but reduced to its first bones, stripped of mourning arrangement, simple enough for a frightened child to follow. She repeated it. On the second repetition, his shoulders dropped by a fraction. On the third, his hands came away from his ears and pressed flat to his own ribs, as if testing whether breath could be trusted again. Around them, the hall stood suspended between scandal and awe. Karen did not look up. If she saw Lady Wrexham's face, she might falter. If she saw pity, she might harden. She gave Thomas only the melody and the count beneath it. 1 pulse for each inhalation, 1 for each exhalation. His breaths lengthened. The nurse made a small broken sound and covered it with a cough. "Again!" he whispered. Karen sang again. By the last phrase he leaned forward until his forehead touched her shoulder. She held still and kept the song steady, one hand at his back now because he had leaned there of his own accord. His heart hammered through morning wool. Then, slowly, it eased. Guests nearest them began to look anywhere else, granting privacy in the only form society knew, strategic blindness. Somewhere above and behind, boards creaked once. She did not hear the step. She felt it in the pause of the room. The Earl had moved from the front aisle to the wing passage. He stood behind the side curtain where the gaslight failed, near enough to see every line of her posture as she bent around his son, not to claim him, not to display compassion, only to shield him from watching eyes. She did not know he was there. Lady Wrexham knew. Karen heard the sharp intake of her breath from the side seats and imagined the calculations assembling at speed. If this became charity, she would claim it. If it became impropriety, she would lay it at Karen's feet. "This is indecent," she said to no one and everyone. "A servant kneeling in the centre aisle." A gentleman in the third row answered without looking at her. "The child is breathing." The rebuke was mild. It landed all the same. Karen shifted her body a little wider between Thomas and the nearest cluster of curious faces. The move was instinctive, maternal, and strategic together. She had spent years absorbing humiliation that belonged to richer women. She could absorb this too, let them discuss her later. Let them call it presumption. The boy's hands were no longer shaking. "Does your chest hurt?" she whispered. He nodded once against her shoulder. "We will count 10 breaths and then stand. Can you do that with me?" Another nod. She counted softly. At 6, he copied the rhythm under his breath. At 10, he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear. He stared at her as if she had stepped out of a story told in a room he used to know. "Mama sang that," he said, astonished, not crying now, only bewildered by recognition. Karen swallowed against the sudden ache in her throat. "Yes." "Where did you hear it?" Before she could answer, the nurse spoke, voice still unsteady. "Master Thomas, we must return to your seat." He shook his head and looked only at Karen. "You stay." The command was small, desperate, absolute. She should have deferred. She should have yielded him to rank and routine. Instead, she chose precision. "I will walk with you to the end of the row," she said. "Then I must return to the music." He considered this with grave concentration beyond his years, then held out one hand. She took it. His fingers were cold and damp. Together they rose. Her knees protested sharply from the hard carpet. She ignored it and guided him 3 steps, then 4, until they reached the aisle edge. The nurse took his other side. He did not release Karen at once. When he finally did, he whispered, "Do not let them play it loud." "I will not." She turned back toward the platform and found the world altered by one degree that could not be undone. The conductor waited at the foot of the steps, baton lowered, face pale with the strain of choosing between decorum and humanity. He spoke under his breath. "Can you continue?" "Yes." "You stopped in the middle of a sacred memorial." "I know." He looked toward the front row, then to the wing where Shadow held another witness. "Then continue better than before." Karen mounted the steps. Her skirt was streaked with dust where she had knelt. Rain had dried in uneven tide lines at her hem. She sat, opened the folio to the interrupted page, and placed her fingers above the keys. They trembled once from reaction now, not fear. She pressed thumb to middle finger until the shake passed. From the side seats, Lady Wrexham spoke through clenched teeth, smile fixed for the nearest patrons. "You have overreached yourself." Karen did not look at her. "I attended a child in distress, my lady." "You abandoned your post." "Yes." The simple answer robbed Lady Wrexham of immediate leverage. Anger without denial had nowhere clean to strike in public. Miss Lydia's fan snapped shut. Miss Anne stared ahead with jaw set. Their mother sank back into her chair, silk whispering like a warning deferred. Karen lifted her gaze and met the conductor's count. 1, 2. She began again at the bar before the break, softer than before, left hand barely touching the bass, so the room had to lean in rather than brace. The strings followed. The soprano entered on a thread. Thomas, at the row end, watched the piano and breathed in time with her pulse. When they reached the fractured section, Karen gave it what she had denied herself all evening. Not flourish, but tenderness. She voiced the hidden inner line her father had marked in pencil years ago, the one that turned lament into promise without cheapening either. It settled through the hall like warm cloth over cold hands. In the wing shadow, unseen by most, the Earl did not move. She finished the final cadence with both hands low and quiet, then let silence stand for a full measure before lifting her fingers. No one clapped. It was morning music, and applause would have been vulgar. Yet the quiet that followed carried more force than ovation. Even Lady Wrexham held her tongue for 3 breaths. The conductor signalled for the next item. Musicians shifted, pages turned. Ceremony resumed its outward shape. Karen remained on the bench through the transition, eyes on the score, pulse still high at her throat. She expected a steward's rebuke, a patron's complaint, a hand on her shoulder dismissing her from the platform. None came at once. Instead, a single voice from the wing, low and controlled, cut through the rustle of paper. "Miss Stewart?" She turned her head. The Earl stood just beyond the side curtain, where light and shadow crossed his face in hard planes. Rain still darkened one sleeve. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze had changed. It no longer inventoried damage, it measured consequence. "You will come behind the curtain when this piece ends," he said. Karen's hand tightened on the page edge until the paper bent. "Yes, my lord." The final chord of the memorial piece hung in the hall like held breath. Karen kept her hands above the keys until the vibration died into wood and wool and gaslight. No one moved for one suspended beat. Then sound returned all at once. Someone sobbed once and stopped. A program slipped from gloved fingers. A chair creaked in the front row, where Thomas sat folded close to his nurse, eyes fixed on Karen as if to confirm she was still there. The conductor gave a curt signal for release, not applause, and turned at once to reorder what remained of the evening. In the same movement from the wing shadow, the Earl's voice cut through the reset of musicians and murmurs. "Miss Stewart, behind the curtain, now." It was not shouted, it reached every corner anyway. Karen rose before the footman could reach the bench. Her knees threatened to loosen when she stepped down from the platform. She locked them and kept moving. The memorial folio was still open to the corrected leaves, her father's angled marks crossing her own in brown and black ink. She closed it carefully, as if roughness might reopen the whole night, and passed it to the steward, who took it with both hands and would not meet her eyes. At the aisle end, Thomas had returned to rigid stillness, but he was breathing evenly. Karen gave him the smallest nod she could without pausing. He blinked once and gripped the nurse's sleeve less hard. Behind her, the next players were already shifting stands for the continuation program. A second keyboard man, pale and uncertain, was being steered toward the bench. Violins retuned in nervous, thin intervals. The memorial was over. The evening was not. The hall required movement, sequence, decorum. Karen crossed to the side stairs with measured steps that did not betray the quickened beat in her chest. The corridor behind the curtain was narrower now that fear had returned to it. Musicians avoided her eyes. The steward pretended to inspect a lantern wick. Lady Wrexham stood 10 paces away with both daughters, profile composed, lips set in a smile too fixed to be real. She looked at Karen's dust-streaked skirt, then at the Earl waiting in shadow, and chose silence for once because open protest in that moment would have exposed need. Karen stopped 2 feet from him and curtsied. "My lord." He did not answer at once. He stood very still, hands clasped behind his back, gaze moving from her wet hem to her split shoes, from the raw skin at her knuckles, to the faint tremor she could not entirely suppress now that the music had ended. The stillness was not indifference. It was a tension held so hard it became a kind of force. "Hold out your hands," he said. She obeyed before pride could interfere. He looked at both palms, at the ragless crack reopened by rosin and keys, at lie burns whitened at the edges. His jaw tightened. "Who dressed this?" "I did, my lord." "When?" "This morning." He lifted his eyes to hers. "You have been bleeding on my wife's score all evening." Shame burned up her throat. "I wiped the pages, my lord. There is no stain." "That is not what I asked." She had no safe answer. She lowered her gaze. "No one else was available." He turned his head slightly. "Steward." The man appeared at once, as if waiting for breath to summon him. "Send for the physician again," the Earl said. "Not for the pianist, for Miss Stewart." The steward blinked. "My lord, the programme is only half now." "Yes, my lord." The steward was gone before the word settled. Lady Wrexham stepped forward 1 pace, silk whispering, "Lord Halhurst, this is unnecessary. The girl seeks attention when corrected. I assure you she is sturdy." The Earl did not look at her. "You will step back, Lady Wrexham." The tone was level. It carried farther than a shout. She stopped. Colour rose high on her cheeks. "She is of my household." He turned then slowly and gave her the same unblinking regard he had given the damaged score. "Not while she is under my roof and under my seal for this performance." The words altered the air in the corridor. Miss Lydia's fan stilled in her hand. Miss Anne looked down at her gloves as if the stitching had become urgent. Lady Wrexham smiled with visible effort. "Surely you do not intend to elevate a servant over established patronage?" "I intend to prevent further interference with the memorial concert." His eyes returned to Karen. "Miss Stewart, did you eat before taking the bench?" The question struck harder than accusation. She felt heat rise to her face. "I am fit to continue, my lord." "That was not an answer." "No, my lord." "When did you last eat?" She hesitated. To answer plainly was to expose Mrs. Davis's kindness and her own deprivation. To lie in front of him felt futile. He had already taken inventory. "Yesterday afternoon, my lord." He was silent for one breath. Two. His face did not change, yet something in his posture set like iron in frost. "Steward," he said, without turning. The man had returned with impossible speed and stood waiting again. "Bring hot broth, bread and tea, here." Lady Wrexham gave a small laugh, meant for witnesses. "If every maid were fed between items, we should perform until dawn." The Earl looked at her at last. "Then it is fortunate this is not your hall." He shifted one half step toward Karen, enough to block the direct line from Lady Wrexham to her, without touching either woman. It was a movement any stranger could call practical. Karen felt it as shelter all the same. "My lord," she said carefully, "if I am absent from the wing too long, Lady Wrexham will dismiss Mrs. Davies and Bess from service for negligence. They gave me no instruction against duty. Any blame will be mine." He studied her face as if weighing each word for hidden motive and finding none. "You are bargaining for other people while your hands are split open. They have less choice than I do." His mouth moved once, not quite a smile, something sharper and sadder. "You misjudge your choices." She lifted her chin despite herself. "With respect, my lord, I know my circumstances." "Do you?" It was not a question, it was the challenge stripped to bone. From the hall came the opening applause for a visiting baritone. Sound rose and fell through heavy drapes. The concert moved on. Backstage no one moved at all. The steward arrived with a tray carried by a kitchen maid whose eyes widened at seeing Karen receive it. Steam lifted from a plain bowl. Bread lay wrapped in cloth to keep warm. The Earl took the tray himself and set it on the prompt desk, clearing space with one sweep of his hand that sent spare pegs rattling into a box. "Eat," he said. Karen stayed where she was. "My lord, I cannot take food in the passage before—" "Eat!" The command held no cruelty. It allowed no refusal. She crossed to the desk and lifted the spoon. Her hand shook once against the bowl's rim. She steadied it and took a mouthful of broth so hot it stung her tongue. Salt, onion, a little barley. The simplest thing in the world. Her stomach cramped at the shock and then eased. She took another mouthful, slower. The Earl remained where he stood, not watching the corridor, not returning to the hall, only holding position between her and Lady Wrexham, as if the line itself mattered. The physician arrived in a rustle of black coat and impatience. "Again! Who is down now?" He saw Karen's hands and stopped speaking. "Ah." He set his bag on the desk, peered at her palms and clicked his tongue. "This should have been dressed hours ago. Hold still, miss." Karen set down the spoon and obeyed. The physician cleaned the cracks with diluted spirits that bit like fire. She made no sound. He bound each palm with clean linen and salve from a tin, then examined the bruise at her wrist where fingers had pressed hard enough to mark. His eyes flicked once toward Lady Wrexham and away. "Keep these dry," he said. "No harsh lie tonight, no lifting crates." "She has further duties," Lady Wrexham said at once. The physician shut his bag with a decisive snap. "Then find another pair of hands, madam, or risk infection and fever in this one. I have buried stronger bodies for less." He bowed to the Earl and left before argument could stain him. Karen flexed her fingers in the new wraps, awkward and grateful in equal measure. "Thank you, my lord. I will return to the bench." "You will not." The words landed like a dropped weight. She looked up. He met her gaze fully now, and for the first time since she had seen him in the gaslight, grief showed through control, not as tears, not as softness, but as exhaustion cut deep enough to leave truth exposed. "I asked you to follow the score," he said. "You did. I asked for restraint. You gave my son breath instead. Then you resumed the peace without punishing him for breaking. I watched all of it." His voice lowered another degree. "I watched you take the wrong note when he cried out. I watched you choose him anyway. I watched Lady Wrexham order you back to the bench while he could not breathe. You heard her. You disobeyed her. You will not be returned to her carriage tonight as if none of that occurred." The corridor had gone silent to the edges. Even the nearest violinist had stopped winding his string. Karen felt the spoon warmth still in her throat, and the cold of rain still in her hem, and the dangerous pull of being seen too clearly by a man with rank enough to make seeing consequential. "My lord," she said, keeping her voice even with effort, "if I do not return with Lady Wrexham, she will lock the attic and throw my things into the yard by morning." "What things?" The question was immediate. Hard. She hesitated. His eyes sharpened. "What things, Miss Stewart?" "A ledger. Some clothing. My mother's thimble. Nothing of value." "Value is not the measure." He turned toward the steward. "Send a man to Milsom Street with 2 witnesses and a written order under my seal. He will collect Miss Stewart's property tonight, every item listed in her hand. If entry is refused, he will note refusal before witnesses and return at dawn with magistrate authority." The steward stared. "My lord, at this hour—" "Now." "Yes, my lord." The man hurried away again, already calling for ink. Karen's pulse pounded so hard she could feel it in her bandaged fingertips. "You do not know what she may do when challenged." The Earl's expression didn't shift. "I know exactly what she may do. That is why I am removing your dependence on her immediate favour." Lady Wrexham's composure broke at last. "This is outrageous. You cannot seize a gentlewoman's household merely because a girl played one song above her station." He faced her with terrible calm. "I have seized nothing. I have secured property belonging to Miss Stewart. If you dispute ownership, you may present account books tomorrow before the same witnesses who heard this exchange." For one moment Lady Wrexham looked as if she might strike Karen there in the passage, with the whole room watching. She did not. She drew herself taller and said, each word polished to edge, "You are making a mistake, my lord." "No," he said, "I am correcting one." A bell sounded from the hall, signalling the interval. Doors opened. Audience voices swelled into the corridor in a bright tide of gossip and silk. The window for private command had closed. Public consequence had begun. The Earl stepped closer to Karen, close enough that she could see the faint silver of rain drying at his collar and the healed pull of scar tissue when he tightened his jaw. "Listen carefully," he said. "During interval you will remain in this wing. You will speak to no one without the steward or Mrs. Davies present. You will take tea and finish the bread. After the final item, you will ride to Halhurst House with my household carriage, not Lady Wrexham's." She stared at him. "My lord, that would be spoken of. It already is. I am not asking for rescue. I am not offering rescue." His voice was quiet, almost harsh. "I am issuing terms for your safety while this house is full of people who have just learned your name." He held her gaze another beat, then added the line that could not be recalled. "From this hour, any instruction given to you by Lady Wrexham that conflicts with mine is void." Karen's breath caught, not from romance, from the magnitude of rank crossing rank in plain speech. There would be no return to invisibility after that sentence, no shelter in being overlooked. Her life, which had survived by narrowness, had just widened into danger and possibility at once. He inclined his head, formal again, as if he had only arranged chairs. "Finish your broth, Miss Stewart," he said. "Then we begin the interval receiving line. You will stand where I can see you." He turned toward the hall and did not look back, but he didn't move far. He took his place at the edge of the curtain, where light from the chandeliers met backstage shadow, and remained there like a fixed point in bad weather while Karen lifted the spoon with bandaged hands and understood that silence, at last, had broken in her favour. Karen finished the broth because he had ordered it, because her body had begun to shake with the delayed cost of fear, and because refusing nourishment in front of those watching faces would have looked like theatre. Mrs. Davies appeared at her elbow with a clean cloth and wiped a drop from Karen's bandage as if she were tending silver, invisible and exact. Beyond the curtain, the interval doors opened and the assembly poured into the promenade in a tide of black silk, her polished boots, and lowered voices sharpened by appetite for scandal. The Earl stood where he had said he would stand, near enough to see her, far enough to make clear she remained under his authority, not his arm. The receiving line formed by custom and rank. Condolence first, commentary second. Attack, if it came, wrapped in etiquette. Karen stood one pace behind the steward's desk with Mrs. Davies and Bess on either side, as instructed, while gentlemen bowed to the Earl and ladies touched gloved fingers to their lips, and praised the memorial with eyes already searching for the story beneath it. The first direct blow came from Lady Wrexham, smiling as if at a christening. "Your lordship's grief has made you generous," she said. "You have turned a copying girl into a performer. One hopes she has not turned your household papers into inventions as well." The Earl did not raise his voice. "Steward, bring the Halhurst archive chest." A murmur ran the length of the line. The chest arrived within minutes, carried by 2 footmen and set on the long table beneath a lamp. It was walnut, bound in iron, travel-worn, seal intact in dark green wax. Karen saw the wax and felt her breath snag. It was the same colour her father had used on receipts when a client insisted on formality they could not pay for. The Earl broke the seal with his signet and opened the lid. Inside lay bundled correspondence, a mourning ribbon, and a folio wrapped in oilcloth against damp. "Witnesses," he said. The clergyman from the front row stepped forward. So did the physician, still in his black coat, and the assembly treasurer with ink on his cuff. Lady Wrexham hesitated, then approached because retreat would have looked like guilt. The Earl lifted one folded letter, yellowed at the edges but clean, and passed it to the clergyman. "Read." The clergyman adjusted spectacles and read in a clear, unwillingly dramatic voice. "To Mr. David Stewart of Cheap Street. If my health fails before the memorial song is complete, you are to copy and complete accompaniment according to my breathing marks. If you are unable, your daughter Karen Stewart, who reads phrasing as you do, is authorized to finish where I cannot." Payment enclosed under separate note, signed Eleanor Ashford, Countess of Halhurst. He stopped, then, more softly, dated 6 months before her ladyship's death. No one spoke for 3 full breaths. Karen could hear the gas jets hiss. Lady Wrexham recovered first. A private letter proves sentiment, not competence. The Earl set a second document on the table, a receipt with David Stewart's name and the Countess's seal, then the memorial folio itself, open to the fractured bars. "Competence was heard in this room," he said. "Authorization is written. Debt claims against Miss Stewart arising from this commission are void under my house's account." His gaze lifted to Lady Wrexham. "You accused her of forgery. Withdraw it." Colour flooded Lady Wrexham's face in 2 hard spots. She turned, saw Thomas at the row end watching Karen, and reached for the child's sleeve as if to pull him away from contamination. Her hand had not fully closed when Karen flinched and stepped, and in that same instant Lady Wrexham's other hand struck Karen across the cheek with a crack too loud for polite company to ignore. The Earl moved once, fast, and stopped with lethal stillness between them. "You will not touch her again." No one mistook the sentence for rhetoric. Lady Wrexham's hand fell to her side. Thomas had gone rigid. Karen's cheek burned, but she stayed upright, one palm on the table to steady herself, and the other held close because of the fresh bandage. The Assembly Treasurer cleared his throat, voice thin with fear and duty. "My lord, while witnesses are present, there is another matter. The charity subscriptions for tonight passed through Lady Wrexham's account this quarter. The disbursement list does not match receipts." He laid a ledger beside the open chest. 3 payments marked to widows and apprentices were not delivered. Lady Wrexham turned on him. "You dare!" He did not look at her. "I brought copies." The Earl scanned the entries once, jaw tightening along the old scar. "This committee will appoint new patronage before the hall opens tomorrow," he said. "Lady Wrexham is removed from all memorial administration effective now. Steward, make notice." Miss Lydia made a small, strangled sound. Miss Anne stared at the floorboards and did not lift her eyes again. The loaded look she had given Karen in corridors for years yielded nothing at last. Whatever calculation lived there, she kept it and lost with it. At that moment the courier from Milsom Street arrived, mud-splashed and breathless, hat in both hands. "My lord, outcome of your order." He set a written inventory on the desk, and one by one the recovered items beside it, a narrow ledger wrapped in cloth, 2 plain dresses, a packet of manuscript leaves, a silver thimble worn smooth, and a small bundle of blue wool scraps stitched with tiny stars. Entry was refused at first by house staff. Witnesses were present. Refusal noted. On sight of seal and magistrate line, attic trunk was produced. No further resistance. Karen touched the ledger's edge with bandaged fingers and closed her eyes for one heartbeat. The physical world returned to her in pieces she could name. The Earl looked at her then, not at the crowd. "Miss Stewart, stay at Halhurst." The line was plain. The room listened as if it were a verdict. She lifted her head. Her cheek still stung where she had been struck. "I will stay, if terms are written. Wages each week, duties named. I will not be kept as charity." "Agreed. And Mrs. Davies and Bess are not to starve for my disobedience tonight. They require paid positions and safe lodging, whether with your household or elsewhere under your protection." "Done." "Also," she said, voice tighter now because this mattered most, "my father's remaining debts are to be examined, not assumed. Any false additions are struck. His name returns to his own ledger clean." The Earl held her gaze without blinking. "Steward, draft all terms under my seal. Include debt audit by morning clerk. Include appointments for Mrs. Davies as housekeeper to the Halhurst Bath residence, and Bess as junior maid with board and meals. Include Miss Stewart as music governess to Thomas Ashford with independent wages and authority over music room accounts. He paused, then added, "Address her correctly in the document." The steward swallowed. "Yes, my lord." By the second week of December, the documents had been executed in the solicitor's chamber with 3 witnesses, and no room for revision. Karen signed with a steady hand. Mrs. Davies signed slowly, lips pressed tight against tears she would not show in public. Bess blotted her name twice and laughed once in disbelief before covering her mouth. The debt audit removed half the claim total as fabricated penalties. The remainder the Earl settled from the Countess Memorial Fund that had been intended for the Stewart Commission years earlier and never paid in full. At the Assembly Room's entrance, a fresh notice named new patron trustees. Lady Wrexham's carriage stopped appearing there. People said she had gone to a distant cousin in reduced circumstances. No one in Halhurst service spoke of her unless asked. On a pale morning in March, Karen stood in the music room at Halhurst House, while Thomas practised scales with grave determination and occasional rebellion. Sun touched the repaired string near middle C, the one she had noticed the first night. She had replaced it herself under the tuner's supervision and logged the expense in her own account book. Thomas missed a left-hand crossing, scowled, and looked up at her. "Again?" he asked. "Again!" she said. From the doorway, the Earl watched in silence that no longer felt like a wall. It felt like weather after storm, still cold, but breathable. He stepped inside only when Thomas reached the opening bars of his mother's song and played them without panic, thin at first, then sure. The Earl's hand tightened on the doorframe. Karen pretended not to see, granting him the same strategic privacy others had once denied her. At dawn in early June, in the small chapel on Halhurst grounds, with mist lying low over the yews, Karen wore plain ivory silk, chosen for ease rather than spectacle, and Mrs. Davies fastened her mother's thimble to a ribbon inside her sleeve, where it rested against her wrist like a blessing made of metal and memory. Thomas stood at the chapel pianoforte, feet barely reaching the pedal, and played the first phrase of his mother's song in careful time. The clergyman asked the vows. Karen answered clearly. The Earl answered without hesitation, voice roughened by feeling he no longer tried to hide behind command. When the register was brought, she signed Karen Stewart Ashford in a hand as precise as engraving, then opened her father's recovered ledger on the vestry table, and, beneath his last entry, wrote one new line with the same brown ink she had guarded all winter. Account settled, name restored, music paid honestly at last. The Earl read it, said nothing, and placed his signet beside hers on the page. Then Thomas struck the final cadence, looked up with fierce pride, and Karen smiled fully for the first time in years.